Well, thank you. This is a great crowd for an early Sunday morning talk. My name is Peter McKay. I'm curator of contemporary Australian art here at QAGOMA and have worked very closely with Patricia and her great team to put Curious Affection together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. This morning, we're lucky to be joined by this great panel, which is being led by Karin Sellberg, lecturer in Humanities, School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry at the University of Queensland. Patricia Piccinini, who I think you all know by now. There you go, just in case you didn't. Aurelia Armstrong, lecturer in philosophy and deputy head of School of Philosophy at the University of Queensland, and Kirrilly Thompson, anthropologist and senior researcher at CQ University's Appleton Institute in Adelaide. Throughout today's discussion, our speakers will explore what it means to be alive, quite a big question, paying some attention to the shifting understanding of the nature-culture divide and the human-animal divide, and maybe some other divides too, I'm not sure. So please help me join me in welcoming our wonderful speakers.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out on a Sunday morning to hear us speak here. I just thought I'd let you know that we're gonna have a little discussion between the four of us throughout this hour, and then towards the end of the hour, we're going to invite you to ask us your questions as well. So we'd really like you to engage with our discussion and to bring your input to what we're talking about as well. As Peter was saying, I'm Karin Sellberg, and I'm a specialist in feminist philosophy, and especially kind of ideas of evolution and history of medicine and science. And we have Aurelia Armstrong here, who's also a feminist philosopher, and Kirrilly Thompson, who's a cultural anthropologist, particularly looking at the animal and human divide and how we think about human versus animal, or kind of the in-between, if there is such a thing. And then obviously, I don't think Patricia Piccinini needs an introduction. We're very honored to be up here with her during this wonderful exhibition. So I'm going to start us off with just a little bit of a question about, well, you know, I feel like this exhibition is a little bit of a journey, and I know Patricia has talked a lot about the journey that she sees every audience going through as you're walking through these spaces. And I thought it would be interesting to think about the actual the specific journey that each of us experienced, considering the background we have and the kind of philosophical and academic expertise that we have. So I thought I'd invite Kirrilly maybe to start, to just give us a sense of the journey you had when you walked through these galleries.
Okay. Thank you, Karin. Well, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so that means I'm interested in my work in human cultures. And despite the fact that humans are pretty much the same species, we have the same physiology, the same psychology the world over, anthropology is really interested in the cultural differences in how we make meaning out of the world. So how we see ourselves as part of one group but not part of another group. The animal equivalent of that kind of research is talking about animals' worlds. It's not spoken about so much in terms of culture, but there is one concept which biologists and ethologists use. It's attributed to Jacob von Wexkull from 1909. He talks about animals as having an Umwelt, which is really a self-centered view of the world that's related to animals' perceptual abilities. So for humans, if we were to translate the Umwelt to humans, we're a very visual species and we're quite tactile. And if you've been through the exhibition, you would have felt very human on all these occasions where you wanted to touch Patricia's sculptures, because that's how we check something's alive. We want to check it's got a heartbeat. We want to know if it feels warm. Our Umwelt is quite different from, for example, a tick. So a tick has no eyes, and this is a famous example that's often spoken about in terms of von Wexkull's work. The tick finds its way around through smell, through temperature, and through crawling through fur and hair. So ticks have a very different kind of world to humans, and dogs have a very olfactory world, and each species has its own kind of world. Now, in my research as an anthropologist, I'm interested in where human and animal worlds come together. So most of my research is about how do humans and animals co-create meaning. And we do this all the time. And the piece in Patricia's work that makes me think about this co-construction of meaning with each other, with the creatures that we're alike and with the creatures to whom we're quite different, is the piece, The Welcome Guest, or the Invited Guest? The Welcome Guest. And it's just delightful. You can just see in this child's face the curiosity and the awe for this other creature, and the other creature's same fascination and understanding for the little girl on the bed. And we have no idea what that creature's Umwelt is like. We don't know if that creature relies on vision or smell or touch or something we don't even fathom yet. But we know that the creature and the little girl are engaged in something that together they have made meaningful and is meaningful to them. And in the whole exhibition, we're invited to make things meaningful that we see. So the creature and the little girl have made something meaningful together. But when I look at that piece, I've started to co-create meaning with them. And Patricia's part of that co-creation, and her team is part of the co-creation. And so there's this series of unfolding relationships through the whole exhibition, and it's not just at a cognitive or a mental meaning-making level. When I walked through the field, I was just obsessed with looking at the way the organ flowers move when people go past, so it's physical as well. And that's, I think that encapsulates my journey around relationships and understanding, and that we can understand creatures that are quite different to us. It shouldn't be a barrier.
Wonderful, thank you. What about you, Aurelia?
Hello, it's lovely to be here. I love this work, and as a philosopher, I suppose I just thought when I was given the question, what does it mean to be alive, that I should approach it as a philosopher rather than as a biologist, obviously because I'm not, but from a philosophical point of view rather than a biological point of view. And from a philosophical point of view, the question of what it means to be alive can be, I think, fruitfully engaged in terms of the idea of having things that matter to you, having concerns, having cares, having interests, having needs. So we tend to think that living things are creatures for whom things matter. And what does it mean to be a creature for whom things matter? Well, it means that you can be affected by the world. You can be harmed or benefited. You're vulnerable in some sense to being changed through interaction with others. And so I approached the work in this way, and to me, the work is an ethical journey. It's an ethical journey that is staged through the very space of the gallery. The way that we enter the gallery, the first gallery. And for me, the way to articulate, actually, Patricia's already articulated this beautifully. She says that she's interested in the journey from the strangeness of otherness to the closeness of connection. And to me, that's exactly what this staging of these spaces, of this whole work is about, and how I experienced it. So, for example, when you walk into the first gallery, we all know, because we all love Patricia's work and we're here because we're interested in it, we all know that we're going to meet and encounter some very strange creatures. And the first gallery sets up the expectation initially because it's a traditional gallery space, It sets up the expectation that we can stand safely at a distance, that we can be the spectator looking at these creatures, marveling at them, wondering at them. They're oddities. They're strange creatures. They're maybe aberrant. We might be slightly disgusted by them. There's something like, we expect the space to be rather like a circus space where we can look at the freaks on display from the distance of, the safe distance of sort of separation. But that's not what we encounter. Even in the first gallery, what we encounter are relationships. We encounter not the sort of circus tent with the freaks on display. We encounter creatures engaged in relationships. Creatures who are in a world where things matter to them. They're interacting. They're in the carrier. We've got a relationship of care, an older person being human, being carried by another creature, not human, but humanoid, recognizable as a creature that loves, that takes care of something else. But once we move through that space and although there's still some degree of safeness, I think, in that first gallery, we still feel that we can keep our distance, but already something's changing. We're not looking at others. We're looking at creatures like ourselves that we can identify with, that we can relate to, because they're in relationships. But we're not yet, if you like, in relationship with them. But I think that changes when we move into the second gallery, the second space. And there, suddenly, we're participants in a world. To have things that matter to you is to be in a world of relationships with other creatures that you can be, as I was suggesting earlier, that you can be affected by. And in the second gallery, we are in another world. There are transgenic flowers. We're confronted by the pollinator. And there is a feeling that I could be affected by. There's something in the air. I'm surrounded by the sound of cicadas. There's something in the air here. Maybe the pollen from these transgenic flowers is beginning to affect me. I can be affected here. And I'm vulnerable. Vulnerability in that space makes me closer to the creatures that I encounter. And I think when I see kindred, I love that piece very much. And I have two responses to kindred. On the one hand, I want to lie down next to the orangutan humanoid mother. She looks strong. She looks big enough to protect me. She's looking after two children, and one of them is human. Maybe she would look after me. Her hands are big enough to hold mine, and I feel like I could be a child of hers. So and that feeling, is a feeling of relating to another being. But on the other hand, that relationship that I feel towards the orangutan mother in kindred feels two-way. So not only do I feel that she could look after me, but there's a sense in which I feel called on to look after her, to protect her. We all know that, of course, orangutans are a threatened species, and that encounter, that ethical encounter, which is made possible by this space where we sort of share a kind of vulnerability with these other creatures, and we're put in connection with them in a deeper way, is for me really the movement from sort of the distance of curiosity, the curiosity that we feel for strange creatures, to the closeness of connection and empathy, the possibility of relating to these creatures who are very different from ourselves, and yet with whom we feel brought into some kind of relation. And that, for me, going through that space, I could talk about each of the works because I love all of them, but the very final moment where we enter into the diorama space, the drive-in, And we see these two, this amorous coupling, these two beautiful humanoid bear-like creatures in their own space, with their own world, with their own interests. And my response to that was, oh, I don't want to disturb them. You know, I feel that they have the right to live, to be what they are, to have their privacy, their own world. So for me, that ethical journey was really astonishing, really extraordinary. And it is, if you like, the movement from curiosity to empathy, from, you know, strangeness to connection, as Patricia put it so beautifully. So that's really, I suppose, my response to the work from a philosophical point of view. And from a human point of view.
I do think it's really interesting, especially that the second room, the second space, because as you were saying, Aurelia, it's the first space is quite a classical exhibition space. You are very much there as an observer, your audience, and you see all these creatures, you encounter all these creatures, but you are at a little bit of a distance. Whereas as you move in through the second space, you have the kind of multi-sensory experience of the cicadas around you, the sound, the movement of the kind of flower organ-like creatures, and then also the movement in the further rooms, in the drive-through of the actual moving picture in the background. I found myself at a moment thinking, oh, did I just catch that creature breathing? I had to take second looks several times because this kind of multi-sensory experience made me feel like everything around me came alive. It was alive for me, and I couldn't really tell what was alive and what wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that really, really strikes me about this exhibition. It's difficult to tell where the boundaries are. What are the boundaries between artwork and audience, between living creature and non-living creature, between human and non-human? I mean, as someone who works in the history and philosophy of science and medicine, I immediately think of what people back in the 17th and 18th century used to say was the very principle of science itself, which is wonder and marvel and the questioning of the boundaries between things. So they said that, yes, there is such a thing as knowledge, and knowledge is a matter of sameness. We see something and we recognize it and we place it into a category. We decide, okay, this is a human, this is a living creature, we categorize it as such. But they said that the real principle behind science as a practice, the real urge behind being a scientist had nothing to do with knowledge. It was wonder and marvel, which is the very opposite of knowledge. It's seeing the differences between things and going beyond those boundaries between what we think is living, what we think is real, and what we think fits into the world. So, and I think that's what this exhibition really inspires for me, this questioning, this, my mind starts to wander. My mind starts to break these kind of boundaries between what I think is living and what's not, what I think is human and what's not. And I mean, the more you look at the creatures, I'm thinking especially of Kindred, the wonderful orangutan mother. I mean, like Aurelia, I feel so deeply for this work. And you know, the longer you look at her and you look at her children, one of them is a little bit more like her than the other. One of them looks practically entirely human. But as I was looking at the children, the orangutan mother started becoming more and more human to me too. And there came a point where I couldn't really tell whether I mean, she didn't look like an orangutan mother to me anymore. She was the same as me. I felt like we got to a space where we were the same. So I guess kind of a journey through boundaries is what this symbolizes for me. I kind of think of it as a bit of a relationscape. It's a landscape of encounters and empathic moments of sharing where I stop being entirely myself and the artworks stop being entirely different from me. And you know, did you notice as you walk through the field and the Erie and the drive-through, I kind of felt like I kind of felt like the artworks started blending into each other and reflecting each other in a way that made it quite difficult to tell where the artwork, that when one artwork stopped and the other one started. It all became a journey, like a continual moving journey. So with this in mind, I mean, we've all talked about here, like, we've all talked about liveliness and what it means to be alive. But what do we actually mean by being alive? I mean, Aurelia mentioned that she looks at it as a philosopher. Really, according to the older scientists, 200 or 300 years ago, there wouldn't really have been much of a difference between a philosopher and a scientist. A scientist was really a philosopher. You wouldn't actually be a good scientist unless you were asking the questions that a philosopher would be asking. I don't know, what do we think of as being alive at all? How do we experience being alive and liveliness in this exhibition? Maybe we should start with Patricia's perspective on it.
Well, it's really great listening to all your ideas. It's wonderful. I can really relate to them. And I guess the world I've created is a lot about a celebration of the potential of life. And that's why, for me, there's a lot of manifestations of fecundity. Like everything is ripe with fruit, with sexuality, with meaning, with potential, but ambiguity as well. And in some ways, the way as a woman, I see that fecundity as a kind of coming from my own fecundity, my own potential to reproduce. And I feel that that's not very valorized in our society. And I've brought that into the world, not in a kind of literal way, but in a kind of a metaphorical way, I suppose. There's lots of mothers, there's lots of children, there's lots of sex. There's a lot of offspring, I suppose. And I think that if you go in that show, there's lots of stuff in there about the boundary, the idea of this disillusionment of boundaries, like everything is intermingled. Nothing sits in its own place. Nothing is completely one thing. Nothing is a plant on its own. Everything is a coming together of things. And I've been interested in doing that for a long time because I find that that categorization, that way of understanding the world around us is very limiting. And in fact, Aurelia, when you were talking to me about the re-enchantment of the environment, that was really inspirational to me about 2 years ago. And that's what I try to do. I try and create these kind of stories, these kind of narratives that people can enter into. And they're not completely obvious, but they have some parameters. Like I was really interested to hear what you said about the welcome guest, which is the work on the bed with the peacock and the creature and the girl. And you focused on the idea that they're creating meaning because of their interaction. And that's really a big part of the work. And for me, that's where that relationship signifies their strength. And it's not something you can put your finger on, it's just that moment. Yeah.
Interestingly, it becomes kind of a reproduction of meaning throughout this as well. In each of our encounters, we feel like there's something else born. I mean, you talk about the fecundity and the sexuality and everything. It's there in your encounter with each of the creatures as well, I think. And there's lots of little mutant ideas create or kind of appearing all around you as you're encountering these creatures. And one of the things I find really beautiful is the fact that this blurring of meaning, the place where, or the blurring of boundaries, the place where the boundaries kind of disappear between you and the artworks, it never feels like intrusive. It never feels violent. You never, I mean, there's never a kind of a discomfort to it. You're invited to engage with these creatures, with these other beings, but there's never a sense of it being forced on you. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I mean, when we talk about transgression and about exceeding boundaries, we keep thinking of it as a kind of almost like a revolutionary move. You're forcing through the limiting boundaries in society. But this is not a forced movement. This is a loving movement.
Yes, I would say that. Oh, I would say it is, and it's incredibly optimistic as well. Like I'm obviously a very strong feminist, but an environmentalist. But I would never be the kind of I would never make a work that's didactic or that would blame people, because I don't think that's really going to work. But I think my tactic is to make a space around these ethical dilemmas that other people can come in and add their interpretation, but also their meaning. Just by viewing something that is just really not of this world, really quite different, it allows others to come up with something really quite different as well. And I think that's positive, because the current dialogues around these things are so, they're just so laden with value judgments and recriminations and so on, and it's just paralyzing and terrifying. So when something like Kindred, we look at her and we know that orangutans are endangered. We know that it's our fault. We know all that. But when we look at her, and it was so lovely to hear that you felt that she could nurture you, because I look at you and I think you are an orangutan mother. because you are an orangutan mother, because you've got 3 beautiful children, you're just like her. And I thought, do you need, and I love that, knowing that, hearing that, and thinking, yeah, that then leads to empathizing with her, like not, because I often feel I want nurturing, but I need to be a nurturer. And then you look at her, and that's what she does. And that makes the connection between us and this idea of orangutans and of the idea that they have meaning in their lives, how they construct meaning between her relationship between her children. We could see that meaningful relationship. And she holds us in that emotion. Like, first of all, we go, oh, that's weird. That's a bit too much. And then we come into it and we go, oh, I can empathize with that. And then she doesn't kind of go in and kick you in the guts and say, I'm going to be dead if you don't, and it's your fault. She kind of holds us in that emotion so that we can kind of be with it. This is what you were talking about. You can be with it. And then when we go out into the rest of our lives, we can act. We can act. We can do stuff. in the way we treat each other and other animals.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that struck me was how there's a lot of transgression of boundaries. I mean, the boundary between the human and non-human, between the artificial and the real, the natural, between you really can't think of any of the ways in which we categorise the world which aren't challenged, I think, in Patricia's work. But that's oddly not what I see. Intellectually, you can look at the work in that way, but what I see is life. What I see is this vital life, this energy, this living force, which is actually shared by me and the works, by us all, that we are somehow together on a journey. So even Heartwood, which I think is a very exciting new work of Patricia's, which really breaks new ground for me, that Heartwood, the tree, Saint Sebastian, without the head, but with these sort of fruit, everything is, but when I look at that, I don't see the strangeness of, the strange helmeted fruit, or what are they? I mean, I find myself asking, what is it? But as well, I feel myself taken up by that sort of vital life that's expressed in that figure, and that I want to care for. I want to nurture that life. And so I think that's a very important ethical insight and effect. It's an ethical effect because you are sharing in something which goes beyond you, and where a lot of the ways that we like to think about and control the world through our understanding or through, trying to make sense of the world, a lot of that seems to sort of become less important. Control becomes less important, and instead you want to participate in some kind of journey that takes you into something that's shared, a kind of a current of vitality. So that for me is one of the other very exciting things about the work.
I really see that vitality as well, like a sense of life force that goes through the entire, especially actually in the second space, as you're going through the journey through the field, the eyrie, the grotto, the drive-through. They kind of meld together and they come together. I mean, it's a breaking of boundaries to an extent, because the boundaries stop making so much sense to you, but it's the life force that really takes over, the liveliness of all of it.
And that sense of wonder, as you pointed out, Karin, when you have this sense of wonder, the urge to control just dissipates. And like this work, the Heartwood, which is at the Eyrie, it is a celebration of life, but no life in particular. It's not, it's just life. Yeah.
Interestingly, it's got a great strength to it. I mean, it's pose. It's in a kind of a classical Greek pose. I mean, it gives a strength of, it gives an idea of strength and endurance, but also of vulnerability. And that's something that I see all the way through your work, actually, is vulnerability and strength coexisting. And almost as though you find your strength in the vulnerability as well. If you look at a creature like Kindred again, it is one of my absolute favorites. You look at the orangutan mother. She's very strong. I mean, you see her muscles, you see her big strong hands, her big strong feet, but her pose is open,
Yes.
and she's opening herself. She's got the children climbing on her.
You can see her vulva.
Oh yes,
Oh my
indeed.
gosh, it's so vulnerable.
And the breasts,
Yes,
the nipples.
Yes, you wouldn't get me sitting like that. No.
And it's but she's so strong in that vulnerability,
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
partly because you see her completely comfortable in that vulnerability.
Yeah,
That is partly what gives her
that's right.
strength.
Yeah.
And I would not want to try to encroach on her boundary unless she invited me, which I feel like she does.
She does, and she has that it's not even a duality, it's an intermingling of strength and through this vulnerability, like I'm doing this, and she holds us at the same time. Yeah, and all of us as, we are so adept at understanding posture. We can read it. We don't even have to talk about it, you know.
I think that vulnerability comes out of the fact that your work shows us how we all exist in relationships. We can't exist by ourselves.
Yes.
Nothing is static and nothing is cellular. Even an organism needs something from its environment to thrive. And one of my favourite philosophers, Donna Haraway, has an amazing quote, which I use all the time for just about everything. And she says that the relationship is the smallest unit of analysis and the smallest unit of being. We just can't, we're never divisible to one. And that's our strength, because as humans, as creatures, we have the ability to form relationships with others, but that's also what makes us vulnerable.
And I think connection is really pivotal here. Connection and relativity. It's not so much the connections themselves or the relationships themselves, but the act of actually making these connections, which is very much what Donna Haraway is pointing to there as well, I think. And it comes down to, I mean, I know Patricia has been talking a lot about ideas of mutation and evolution, and how we kind of consider ourselves to be some sort of apex of the evolution. And I think that's something that comes out of evolutionary science quite often when we discuss it in the sciences. We think of, oh well, you know, these creatures are really important, and they're really important to study these creatures' environment because they're close to humans. The closer a being is to humans, the more important they become to us. And I mean, as a feminist philosopher and someone who particularly studies a lot of feminist evolutionary theories, it's not so much about the kind of the hierarchy of the evolution. It becomes much more about the actual connections that are being made and the new connections that are being made throughout the kind of the evolutionary cycle. It's less an evolution that goes in a linear fashion from one point, from a one-cell organism to human at the very extreme, but rather the way in which change and difference and mutation kind of creates new connections, new similarities, and new means of connecting to another creature. And that's something I see very much in your work, Patricia. I see that kind of feminist way of looking at relationships to other beings in the world.
And it is quite at odds with what is happening in the world, with this emphasis on individuality, on the going forward and being responsible just for yourself and for your own interests. And I think this work is a kind of saying, actually, no, we are all connected. And like Donna Haraway also says, she says, how can we go forward? We need to go forward together with other animals. We can't go forward by ourselves. We can't fix the world by ourselves even. We'd like to think we can. It's a kind of hubris to think that we can, isn't it? She says we can do it together with other animals. And that implies an amazing kind of respect for their life force and who they are and what they do in the world that we just don't have, even when we're trying to be caring for them even.
I mean, I think that, you know, what this exhibition can achieve to some degree, and again, why I think it's very ethical, and it is an ethical intervention, is that it reminds you that you're a part of nature.
Yes.
And it actually stages that by putting you in the position of being in an environment that's immersive. But, you know, being a part of nature is very different from being standing outside of it and thinking, how can I use it, or what kind of resources can it provide me with? What are these creatures that I can study? How can I, you know, it's very different from looking at the world as a subject looking at an object that can be used. And this is a traditional sort of philosophical framework that often underpins science. You know, we're subjects, we look at the world as a world of objects, we manipulate, control, manage, and engage with the world in that way without including ourselves in the picture. Seeing ourselves as, you know, and our interests as paramount. And imagining that we can control what nature does. And I think that this work is important because it reminds us that we don't control what nature does, but that we're a part of a process, we're a part of nature, and that's the way we need to see ourselves, as a part of nature.
And also that this nature is changing.
Is changing.
Like, how can I talk about nature inside an artificial place like an art gallery?
Yeah.
You know, and how can that be? Well, I'm doing it because actually our understanding of it really needs to be kind of expanded. I don't know where it needs to go. I don't have those answers. Those answers need to come from you. And together we go forward and we think about what is this nature that we are an integral part of. Together with technology, because we can never get rid of that.
It is a matter of receptivity, of actually listening to these artworks and to the people around you as you're kind of experiencing them. Because I think like this idea of objectivity, it kind of puts us outside. We are there to interpret what's happening. We have the language to interpret what's happening. In order to actually really connect with an animal or another like a different creature from ourselves, we need to be able to let them give us their language as well and their viewpoint. And you have to really be able to take them in, not just from your perspective, but also from their perspective, to be able to see and hear and sense their perspective.
But I think the greater lesson is to take. We can look at Patricia's creatures and think that is so different to me, but actually there's something similar, something familiar about that creature. But actually that's what we need to do with each other. And as a human species, we see people of different colours, different classes, different religions. It's because we see them as other to us that we can drop some ethics. Sometimes we do drop our ethics. We actually have responsibilities of care to one another as humans, and we need to see in our everyday interactions with people of our own species that we see differences, we see people that are not like us in the same way that we might look at a creature in the exhibition. And somehow it takes such a different creature for us to realise the judgments we make about others.
That's so true, Kirrilly. That's actually what I'm trying to do. Because sometimes when we're faced, and we were talking about this, Aurelia, when you're faced with real life situations, you're overwhelmed by all kinds of different emotions. Like, for example, with refugees. We are the same people, but we treat them terribly. And that is because we're overwhelmed with a whole bunch of other emotions. Emotions to do with our own place in our own security. All of those things come into play. And it inhibits us from being able to empathise and do the right thing, not the right thing, a good thing by them, but also by us.
But seeing our similarity makes us vulnerable, yes. and I think that's what we fear. We kind of make them different because it's a vulnerability to see in someone else who is in a difficult position. A little bit of yourself. I mean, it kind of brings us into their trauma and their pain. So I think, this exhibition really invites us to make ourselves more vulnerable by seeing the similarities. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. And thank you, Patricia and Kirrilly and Aurelia.